already with a book that's already out. Um, I really am no longer interested in the process by which I wrote that book. Um, the only time the question comes up is when I'm on a book tour and I'm reading a selection from a book that's been recently published. I generally also read things that I've written in the past, and occasionally I'll get a question as to how did such and such get written. In many cases, actually, I forget. Much of what I've been written has been poetry. Certainly, most of the work I wrote from when I started writing in the mid 1950s um, to, let's say, work that I've done in the last 10, 15 years has been almost exclusively poetry. Um, and the process, there's not one process. The poems come in different ways. So I don't know if any of your students are poetry writers, if they write poetry occasionally. I think you mentioned it was a creative writing class, so presumably you have a few poets in there. And sometimes lines will come to me, a few lines. On very rare occasions, a poem will come almost in its entirety. Um, if you, I don't know whether I sent you my last collection, which has a very lengthy poem in 10 sections. That came basically with the title. So there's no overall general definitive statement I can make about the process. The book that you're teaching, which I guess is the Montreal memoir, Stone in My Shoe in Search of Neighborhood, that had an unusual beginning. Evelyn, who was the author of Teaching Arabs, writing himself, and I were at a writers' colony in Virginia, and I was working on a collection of poems. I was finishing it, actually, doing a fine editing, and I did it more quickly than I expected to. And I had a few weeks left over at this writers' colony that we were at, and I was at loose ends, and she suggested that I write about Montreal. As she indicated, it's my my native city, and something, according to her, that I was always talking about. And I think she was tired of me pestering her and interfering with her work. And I thought about it. I had never thought about writing anything about this thing that was so familiar to me. Why write about it? There's nothing to explore. I thought I knew it all. But it was interesting, and actually the most pleasurable book that I ever wrote, pleasurable for me, because I was looking back into material that at the same time was familiar, old streets that I remembered very well, old incidents that I remembered very well. But at the same time, I found myself discovering things that were really fresh to me. And it's it started off basically with a looking into the things that were familiar, moments I remember of my own childhood, an experience where I almost drowned, my first day at school, going to high school, Jewish holidays, and I thought at first that it was going to be a kind of excursion into autobiography, sort of highlights of my growing up. I never anticipated that it would result in what you have in front of you. So it expanded. I found myself working with my own family, basically, looking at my parents in the old country, the Poland that my mother spent her childhood in what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire that my dad was born into, that became Romania, then the Soviet Union, now part of the Ukraine, and then their passage to the New World, to Canada. And then talking about my community, which was a ghetto, really. The neighborhood that I grew up in perhaps, had very few non-Jews. The street I grew up on had one family that was French Canadian, Catholic French Canadian. The high school I went to, with 1,100 students, probably had no more than 6 students who were not Jewish. And then it became not only my neighborhood, but sort of all neighborhoods, all communities. And finally, the way in which human beings connect to one another. So what you will see immediately when you read is a story about a family, an extended family, basically. But it has resonances. It bends into larger considerations. The ethnic community is a community of supposedly outsiders, and ultimately deals with the largest questions of how people connect to one another, which I suppose is very timely when you think of what's going on in this country now, this election, which expresses the divisiveness of the country. So it was only after I worked on the book for a long time that I realized that there were 2 journeys. Journey of my parents, who moved from one set of values in the old country to a new set of values in the Montreal that they discovered, and the journey that my brother and I take from the values of my parents, the values they bring over for the old world, to the values that we finally acquire from Canadian mass culture, basically. So I guess the point to be made here, Liz, is that very often when you begin in any creative enterprise, you really don't know where you're going to wind up.
Sorry, hang on a minute. I knew that would happen, sorry.
I've got a fan there, I see, right?
Pardon me?
I've got a fan there, I see.
Yeah, I know. It's like, this is how working at home is a little bit of a flawed situation.
I will send the dog an autographed copy of the memoir. Are you ready? Can I continue?
Yeah, keep going. I'm listening.
You're very dark. I can scarcely see
I know,
you.
I'm turning on, I'm moving to another. I'm turning on a light. Oh, that's not gonna work.
You're turning into a mystery lady.
I had somebody in charge of hostessing, and that person has not shown up, so.
There's a poem that I often quote, and it has a refrain line, I know by going where I have to go. But very often when I start something, whether it's a poem or clearly in this case in the memoir, I never knew how this was going to wind up. I knew that I was exploring, that I was digging basically, that I was after something. But this eventual product of, oh, hang on for half a second. Let me just, Ruan, I'm doing an interview. I'll call you back, okay? Bye-bye there. Sorry about that.
It's trending.
So you can use this actually, demonstrates that writers also answer the telephone. So so much for process. I can talk about process then in this particular instance, but I wouldn't use this particular instance to say that the process for George Ellenbogen is such and such. It really is quite different for different people, for different pieces.
Right, and I mean, you're kind of making writing sound easy.
Well, it is and it isn't. It's work. Yeah. It's work. But I would say this, as I mentioned before, this book was a lot of fun to work on. When I've done other things, I mean, most recently, I've turned a 10-part poem into a play, that was hard work. And most often when I write poems and they come slowly, as that 10-part poem called The Rhino Gate did, um, there's a lot of work there. There really is a lot of backbreaking work.
Yeah, so you gave me a lot to think about. So, it seems like it was a writer's journey, and then it was a journey back into the time and that period of your neighborhood. And it seems
Well,
that there's nostalgia, and it kind of makes me feel a little bit jealous.
it's a book that really made me do a lot of things that I hadn't done before.
Yeah.
So, for example, um, I had very vivid memories of the street that I grew up on. You
Yeah.
remember there are photographs of it in the book. Actually, I returned to Montreal to take pictures of the houses that I first remember, the lumberyard wall that we used to throw a ball up against, and so on when we played street games. But I found myself having to use um, the archives in Montreal's municipal buildings to get information on the houses when they were put up. And I was very fortunate in being introduced by my publishers to Montreal's um, uh, first-rate architectural historian, a lady called Susan Bronson, who got me onto websites so that I could do a lot of the work from right here, from my study, and get into the archives and really determine when a house was built, what the housing code was then, what it was built of. Was it built of wood? In which case it was represented in pink on a map, or whether it was built of brick and stone. Um, so that was something I'd never done before. I mean, my goodness, when you write lyrical poems, you're not doing research. Um, so that was very interesting. And then I was led by an old dear friend to genealogies that gave me access to the stories of my forebears, and I was able to see exactly when they left, when they were living in particular towns, when they moved, where they moved, able to get onto ships' manifests and get information that way. Um, so the process um, is uh, is a complicated subject. I mean, you can see that it varies from work to work. I mean, for example, you're a literary scholar, so the process in your case in writing um, standard academic prose, basically, it would lead you to certain research vehicles and so on. Then you do an outline, then you write a rough draft, and then do the edit and edit until you had a final copy, and then you would send it out to magazines or to publishers, etc. I suppose the process in my case um, is what shall I say? Is maybe a little less mechanical, is a little bit more stop and start, has abrupt stops, is a little bit tangential at times, a little less predictable. I remember when I was in your situation and having to write a PhD dissertation on Swift's poetry, and there's sort of a standard practice. You read everything there is to know on the subject. You read the important academic critics. You weigh their arguments. You come to your own conclusions. You scope it out. You show it to an advisor and so on. It's really a predictable process, and it gets repeated. If there are 100 theses written, probably 95 work that way. Um, uh, with me, very often, I don't know what I'm going to write about. So at this moment, I'm working on a novel.
Mhm.
And, you know, I'm toward the end of a good first draft. I hope a good first draft. Um, and then I hope when I'm working on that, that other things come, that perhaps a poem comes. I'm planning a piece on the Arctic, and I'm hoping that I'll get a little bit of material as I'm working on the novel. So when I'm working, and that's generally the case, and I think it's the case with most writers, when you're working on one thing, often the stove is starting to heat up for something else. Um, and and it's tough if it doesn't, because I think the worst thing for a writer is to finish something and then not to have anything else to do. The writer never wants to be confronted by a blank page. It's the worst possible thing. So often when I'm teaching, which you're doing now, Liz, I do free writing with students where they sit in groups of 3 or 4 and just write anything. And they write for about 5 minutes and then they'll read what they've done to one another. Uh, and it might be utter nonsense. On the other hand, they might get a line or two or a sentence or an image. Um, and and they might start something and then start something else, and then start something else. It's always good to have a few things that you're working on so that you never have to deal with a blank page.
I agree. So I was, did want to cover something that we talked about before, and that is the writing and combining your memoir with Evelyn's memoir and how you
Sure.
see the significance of
Sure.
that.
Well, Evelyn and I, just a little history.
Yeah.
Evelyn and I lived together for 32 years. Um, um, her work, her important work, was in Arab American with Arab American materials. So her first book, you might know, is sort of foundational text, a study of Arab and Arab American women. The second, a collection of short stories. The two memoirs were uh, the last things we did together. We tended to look at each other's work and to function as editors of each other's work. And uh, Evelyn started working on that memoir probably in about 2008. She died in 2010. And she was working on it when she was ill. Um, and we would read sections to one another and so on. Neither of the books was published when she died in 2010. And I had to look around actually and finally found Interling Press, which was, I thought, just the perfect house for it. The publisher, Michel Mouchebek, is, I think, the major publisher of Arab American literature in America. He liked the manuscript. It was very strange, actually. We published the manuscript. I thought we had gone over it very, very carefully. But there were still, I think there were 3 passages where Evelyn had parentheses around a particular word. So she had made three word choices. And then when we went through her manuscript, we would talk about which was the best word. And usually in a case like that, it's a difficult choice. I mean, one word will give you something, but it doesn't give you something else. And so, and I thought we had covered all of them, but apparently we hadn't. And the publisher got back to me and said, you know, there are three places in the manuscript where you have parentheses around 3 words. You know, what do I do? And actually, I was so apprehensive about making that decision on my own. I got in touch with an old friend of hers that she was a mentor to, who was a writer herself. And we went over it together, actually, and made the final decision. But I think the meat of your question is, why publish the 2 things together? Because they are coming out in German as we speak. They will be coming out in French, and not just the 2 memoirs within one set of covers, but there'll be essays, scholarly essays on them, an excellent introduction to the German edition by a major German scholar, and ultimately they'll be coming out in English. And I really wanted them to appear that way because, in a sense, it represents an aspect of our lives together. We have, in a sense, different ethnic roots. Evelyn's Lebanese, mine Middle European Jewish, and I think we had wonderful lives together. And in a sense, those two books together come through to me as a kind of metaphor that makes a statement. The importance of two divergent cultures coming to realize that they have more to celebrate. There's more that unites them than divides them. And that's important. It's vitally important to the point of survival, that they get it and get it to the point where they don't really tolerate one another's presence, tolerate one another's cultures, but learn to celebrate them and mean it.
That's awesome. That's beautiful. And I wish that we had a little more of that. I'm sure it happens all the time, but it seems that the opportunity to really frame these two stories explicitly seems unusual.
I think a good thing for the students to do is to look at things like that. What apprehensions do we share, myself and Evelyn? What do we revel in? What is precious to us? How do we connect with our parents? How do we connect with our cultures? How do we deal with being figures between our ethnic culture and the culture of assimilation?
Right. So maybe that's the thing that you had in common, because I think when we read stories of assimilation, or we just read a graphic novel, The Best We Could Do, and the subjects are Vietnamese, but students who had a similar experience from different countries could relate to that process.
Yeah. Good.
So I just wonder what themes that you thought were both in your book, or intersecting themes, or any tensions between your memoir and her memoir.
I'd have to think about that.
Okay.
I mean, it's that would not be something that I would consciously think about.
Yeah.
I mean, my book has a particular structure, as does Evelyn's. So if you look at Evelyn's, for example, it's set up in three parts, right? There's one part that deals with childhood. There's another part that deals with her professional career, teaching abroad. And the last two pieces are coda pieces. They're pieces of departure, where in a sense she's moving into an older, deeper age, and partially about dying. I think if you go through, really more important for you to locate what is thematically important for you. For me, what I find interesting is her search for a kind of certitude. Look at the last part of the book, the very last passage of the book, where she pictures herself in water and standing on tiptoe, and other people are swimming into deeper water, taking risks. And she sees herself back a little bit and writing stories. And you might ask yourself whether that picture that she presents of herself as one of an individual who's tentative, who's a little bit apprehensive about stepping into the deep water and getting into the large areas of risk, whether that really captures her, or whether it's something that lingers from childhood. But I think, according to people who've looked at her work, they see her as having taken the bold steps of having an individual coming from a very traditional family and really putting herself out there and becoming a spokesperson and dealing with conflict and so on.
All right, well, that's great, because I saw those things that you come to think of it, that reading these two memoirs together, I do feel like that tension with assimilating was a theme, even though they're very different stories. That was something I thought was something that you had in common.
Mm.
But very broad, in a good way.
Yes, yes, yes. I follow.
Well, this was great. You gave me a lot to think about. I was taking notes, and then my paper got too full. So I think I'm going to take a look at this. But I think you gave students a lot to think about, and a way to appreciate not only the process, but the product itself, the significance of the product, and then also the collaborative aspect of the project.
Good.
Um,
And
and
feel free to phone back and to get in touch, stay in touch if there's any way it could be helpful.
okay.
Thank you very much, Liz.
Okay. All right.